On the bridge of the battleship Nagato, Admiral Yamamoto stood looking out at the gray expanse of the Pacific, a man burdened by a terrible foresight. To the sailors saluting him, he was the god of the combined fleet, the embodiment of imperial strength. But deep within his own heart, Yamamoto felt not the thrill of conquest, but the heavy, cold dread of a gambler who knows the house always wins. He was the most brilliant strategist in the Japanese Navy, yet he found himself in the agonizing position of preparing to fight a war he had spent his entire career trying to prevent. His journey to this precipice began decades earlier. Born as Isoroku Takano in the snowy, stoic region of Nagaoka, he was a son of the samurai class, raised on stories of his father's resistance against the emperor's forces during the Meiji Restoration. This heritage instilled in him a complex loyalty, a willingness to die for his country, but a deep skepticism of blind obedience. As a young man, he was not the boisterous, saber-rattling type. He was quiet, observant, and possessed a mind that functioned like a steel trap, calculating odds and outcomes before others had even drawn their swords. The young Isoroku's first taste of the reality of war came in 1905, amidst the smoke and thunder of the Battle of Tsushima. As a cadet on the cruiser Nishin, he witnessed the legendary defeat of the Russian fleet. It was a glorious victory for Japan, but for Isoroku, it was a bloodbath. A Russian shell exploded near him, tearing into his left hand and severing two of his fingers. As he looked at his maimed hand, the romanticism of the samurai code vanished, replaced by the cold, mechanical brutality of modern artillery. He realized then that spirit alone could not stop a high-explosive shell. While his peers celebrated Tsushima as proof of Japan's divine destiny, Isoroku took away a darker lesson. War was a matter of logistics, technology, and terrible cost. He carried this pragmatism with him as he rose through the ranks. In 1916, at the age of 32, he was adopted into the prestigious Yamamoto family, a common practice to preserve noble lineages lacking in heir. Isoroku Takano was gone. Isoroku Yamamoto was born. With a new name and a higher station, he began to shape the future of the Imperial Navy, not with tradition, but with innovation. Yamamoto was a man of contradictions. He loved geishas and gambling, often staying up all night playing poker or shogi, testing his luck and reading his opponents' faces. Yet, when it came to naval strategy, he gambled on nothing. He became a fierce advocate for naval aviation, arguing that the era of the massive battleship was ending. While the gun faction admirals worshipped the idea of giant cannons, Yamamoto looked to the sky. He pushed for aircraft carriers, understanding that the next war would be fought over the horizon, not hull to hull. By the late 1930s, however, the atmosphere in Tokyo had turned poisonous. The Imperial Army, drunk on its invasion of China, began to clamor for an alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Yamamoto, serving as Vice Minister of the Navy, stood as a stone wall against this tide. He knew the world map better than the army generals. He knew that aligning with Hitler meant war with Britain and America. In heated meetings, he stated plainly that Japan would be crushed by the industrial might of the West, a truth that the nationalists refused to hear. His logic made him a pariah. The streets of Tokyo became dangerous for him. Ultranationalist groups labeled him a coward and a traitor to the Yamato spirit. He received hate mail written in blood, and military police had to guard his home. Rumors swirled that the army was planning to assassinate him to remove the final obstacle to the tripartite pact. Yamamoto lived with the constant expectation of a bullet in the back, yet he refused to silence his warnings, writing in his diary that to die for one's beliefs was the true way of the samurai. Fearing for his life, the Navy minister made a desperate decision in 1939 to get Yamamoto out of the political crosshairs of Tokyo. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet and sent back to sea. It was an exile disguised as a promotion. Safe aboard his flagship, he was beyond the reach of the Army's assassins. But he was also removed from the halls of power, where he might have stopped the slide toward war. The ocean became his sanctuary and his prison. From the deck of his ship, Yamamoto watched helplessly as the government signed the pact with Germany and marched toward the abyss. The very war he had risked his life to prevent was now knocking at the door. The irony was absolute. The man who best understood the folly of fighting the United States was now the man charged with devising the strategy to destroy it. He knew the industrial statistics. He knew the oil reserves. He knew the end of the story before the first chapter was written. And so, the reluctant warrior began to pace his cabin, staring at maps of the Pacific. If his country insisted on committing suicide, he reasoned, it was his duty to make the death throes as magnificent as possible. He began to conceive of a desperate, high-stakes gamble, a strike that would require all his luck and all his skill. He turned his eyes toward a small island outpost in Hawaii, realizing that his only hope lay in breaking the enemy before the war truly began. When Isoroku Yamamoto arrived in Boston in 1919 to study at Harvard University, he stepped into a world that felt less like a foreign country and more like a different planet. While his peers in the Imperial Navy were turning their eyes toward the rigid discipline of Prussian Germany, Yamamoto found himself immersed in the chaotic, roaring energy of post-World War I America. He was a short man, standing only 5 feet 3 inches, yet he walked with a quiet confidence among the towering American undergraduates. He did not isolate himself in the library. Instead, he threw himself into the current of American life, driven by an insatiable curiosity to understand what made this massive nation tick. At Harvard, Yamamoto was an anomaly. While he studied English and petroleum economics, his true classroom was the dormitory common room and the local social clubs. He quickly discovered that the American character was best revealed not in textbooks, but across a card table. He became an obsessive player of poker and bridge, games that required psychological insight and calculated risk. In the smoke-filled rooms of Cambridge, he learned that Americans were not the soft, commercial traders dismissed by Japanese nationalists. He saw that they were fiercely competitive, individualistic, and when pushed, possessed a stubborn refusal to lose, traits that he filed away in his mind with unease. His curiosity soon pushed him beyond the Ivy League walls. During his breaks and later during his tenure as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., Yamamoto did something almost unheard of for a Japanese officer. He became a hitchhiker. He traveled across the vast North American continent, often relying on the kindness of strangers. As he rode in the passenger seats of Fords and Chevrolets, watching the endless horizon of the Midwest roll by, he began to grasp the sheer, terrifying scale of the United States. In Japan, one could travel from coast to coast in a day. Here, the land seemed to go on forever, a physical manifestation of endless resources. The true epiphany, however, came in the industrial heartland of Detroit. Yamamoto toured the automotive factories, standing on the catwalks above the assembly lines. He watched in awe as raw steel was pressed, welded, and bolted into finished automobiles with a rhythmic mechanical efficiency he had never seen before. He noted that in America, a car was a tool for the common worker, whereas in Japan, it was a luxury for the aristocracy. He realized then that these factories were sleeping beasts. The same lines churning out family sedans could be retooled in a heartbeat to produce tanks and aircraft engines by the thousands. If Detroit was the muscle of America, Texas was its blood. Yamamoto's visit to the oil fields of the South was perhaps the most sobering experience of his life. He looked out over a landscape punctuated by thousands of oil derricks pumping black gold from the earth in quantities that defied comprehension. He supposedly remarked to a colleague that the oil production of Texas alone exceeded that of the entire Japanese empire. He understood the math of modern warfare better than anyone. Fleets needed fuel, and Japan had none. To fight a nation that sat atop an ocean of oil was not just difficult, it was suicidal. Throughout his travels, Yamamoto also observed the American fascination with aviation. He was in the country during the frenzy surrounding Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic flight, witnessing how the entire nation looked to the sky with optimism and ingenuity. While the gun faction back in Tokyo was still obsessing over bigger battleship cannons, Yamamoto saw that the American industrial machine was perfectly primed for an air war. He recognized that their capacity to innovate and mass-produce technology would eventually overwhelm any qualitative advantage Japan might initially hold. In Washington, he walked the halls of power, observing the messy, loud process of democracy. He saw how Americans argued and bickered, a stark contrast to the enforced unity of Imperial Japan. However, he also possessed the wisdom to look deeper. He realized that this apparent division was deceptive. He understood that if this chaotic sleeping giant were ever united by a common enemy or a surprise attack, the bickering would stop instantly, replaced by a singular, terrible resolve. He saw a resilience in the American spirit that his superiors back home, blinded by their own propaganda, completely failed to see. When Yamamoto finally returned to Japan, he carried a heaviness that no one else could quite understand. He had not just visited a potential enemy. He had measured them and found his own country wanting. He tried to convey the scale of the threat to his colleagues, telling them about the smoke of Pittsburgh and the oil of Texas. But to the insular army officers who had never left Asia, Yamamoto's stories sounded like exaggerations or, worse, admiration for the enemy. They mocked his American ways, suspicious of the man who liked Lincoln and drank whiskey. The tragedy of Isoroku Yamamoto was that his time in America gave him the gift of prophecy, but the curse of powerlessness. He walked into the planning meetings in Tokyo with the roar of Detroit factories still ringing in his ears. When the ultranationalists spoke of spirit defeating materialism, Yamamoto could only see the endless rows of oil derricks. He knew that spirit could not turn water into gasoline, nor could it stop a production line that never slept. Thus, the architect of the Pacific War was created not by hatred of the United States, but by a profound, fearful respect for it. He knew the giant he was about to wake better than the giant knew itself. As the war clouds gathered, Yamamoto realized that his knowledge would not be enough to stop the conflict, but it would be the burden he carried as he designed the strategy to survive it. A strategy born from the terrifying realization that he was entering a fight he had already calculated he could not win. In the smoky, wood-paneled conference rooms of the Navy Ministry, Admiral Yamamoto was often the only man armed with a spreadsheet in a room full of men armed with swords. While his colleagues spoke passionately about the divine destiny of the emperor and the unconquerable spirit of the Japanese soldier, Yamamoto spoke of tons, barrels, and kilowatts. He would slide papers across the mahogany tables, pointing to rows of stark figures that spelled out a death sentence for the empire. To the ultranationalists, these numbers were boring administrative details. To Yamamoto, they were the grim coordinates of an inevitable defeat. He tried to make them visualize the beast they were poking. He described the United States not as a country, but as a continental factory that never slept. He pointed to the production of steel, the very skeleton of modern warfare. In 1941, the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh alone were pouring out more steel in a month than the entire Japanese empire could produce in a year. Yamamoto knew that steel did not just mean battleships. It meant the ability to replace losses. He argued that if Japan lost a ship, it was a national tragedy. If America lost a ship, it was merely a production order to be filled by the next fiscal quarter. But the resource that haunted Yamamoto's nightmares was oil. He looked at the Imperial Navy, the magnificent battleships, the agile cruisers, the new aircraft carriers, and he saw them not as weapons, but as gluttonous machines that were starving. Japan produced almost no oil of its own, relying on imports for over 90% of its fuel. The cruelest irony, which Yamamoto often pointed out with a bitter dryness, was that the very fuel powering their training maneuvers came from the United States. He knew that the moment war was declared, the American tap would be turned off, and the Imperial Navy would begin to die, bleeding out its reserves with every nautical mile traveled. Yamamoto's mind often drifted back to the assembly lines he had seen in Detroit, contrasting them with the workshops of Osaka. He tried to explain to the army generals that modern war was a war of motors, not bayonets. He knew that the factories churning out Fords and Chevrolets could be retooled overnight to build tanks, jeeps, and airplane engines by the thousands. Japan's industry, still largely reliant on skilled artisans and manual labor, simply could not scale up. He warned that while Japanese Zero fighters were masterpieces of engineering, they were built like Swiss watches, slowly and carefully. while American planes would soon be built like sausages in endless, overwhelming chains. To illustrate the madness of the situation, Yamamoto often used a simple, brutal analogy with his subordinates: the beggar and the millionaire. If a millionaire loses half his fortune in a gamble, he would say, he is still a rich man who can live comfortably. If a beggar loses his last coin, he freezes to death. He viewed the United States as a nation with a margin for error so vast it was practically infinite. They could afford to lose battles, fleets, and islands. Japan, operating on the razor's edge of scarcity, could not afford to make a single mistake. One major defeat would shatter the fragile logistical spine of the empire. He also foresaw the Achilles heel that the army refused to acknowledge: the merchant marine. Japan was an island organism that needed to inhale raw materials from the South Seas to survive. Yamamoto looked at the maps and saw thousands of miles of vulnerable ocean shipping lanes. He knew that American submarines would not need to fight the Yamato. They would simply need to sink the slow, defenseless tankers bringing iron and rubber to the home islands. He envisioned a war where the factories in Tokyo would fall silent not because they were bombed, but because they had nothing left to manufacture. Despite his lucid warnings, the military leadership was intoxicated by a delusion of quality over quantity. They countered Yamamoto's statistics with talk of the Yamato Damashii, the unique spiritual will of the Japanese people. They argued that the Americans were soft, luxury-loving capitalists who would crumble before the ferocity of a samurai attack. Yamamoto found this racial arrogance not just offensive, but strategically suicidal. He retorted that while spirit could sustain a soldier in a trench, it could not fly an airplane without gasoline, nor could it deflect a hail of anti-aircraft fire generated by a computerized tracking system. In his final desperate audiences with Prime Minister Kono, Yamamoto's tone shifted from analytical to pleading. He laid bare the economic reality. Japan had stockpiles for perhaps a year or two of all-out war. After that, the machinery would grind to a halt. He was essentially telling the government that they were planning a war with no exit strategy, a sprint into a marathon. But the momentum of history was against him. The army had already promised the emperor victory, and the silence of the factories was drowned out by the shouting of the crowds. This industrial anxiety was the crucible that forged the Pearl Harbor Plan. Yamamoto realized that because Japan could not win a war of attrition, it had to win the war in the first afternoon. The decisive battle doctrine was not a choice. It was a necessity born of poverty. He had to strike a blow so devastating that it would break American morale before their terrifying industrial engine could fully awaken. He was not planning a conquest. He was planning a grand raid to buy time, hoping to negotiate a peace before the oil ran dry. As the fleet prepared to sail, Yamamoto carried the crushing weight of the truth. He knew that the war would not be decided on the battlefield, but in the blast furnaces of Pennsylvania and the oil fields of Texas. He was a man watching a tragedy unfold in slow motion, knowing that once the first shot was fired, the sleeping giant would rise, and the industrial avalanche he had predicted would begin its slow, unstoppable slide toward Tokyo. By the late 1930s, the streets of Tokyo had become a dangerous place for a man of reason. The imperial capital was swept up in a fever of ultranationalism, fueled by the dazzling military successes of Nazi Germany in Europe. The imperial army, having observed Hitler's Wehrmacht crush opposition with lightning speed, became convinced that the future belonged to the Axis powers. They clamored for Japan to join a formal military alliance with Germany and Italy, viewing it as the golden bus to global dominance that Japan could not afford to miss. Standing firmly in the middle of this road, arms crossed and face grim, was Isoroku Yamamoto. Yamamoto, then serving as the Vice Minister of the Navy, formed a stubborn triumvirate of opposition along with Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yanai and Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue. Together, they were the Navy left, the last sanity check in a government sliding toward madness. While the army generals looked at maps of Europe and saw German victories, Yamamoto looked at a globe and saw the oceans. He understood what the army refused to see. Signing a pact with Hitler would not intimidate the United States and Great Britain. it would guarantee them as enemies. He argued that linking Japan's fate to a land power in Europe was strategic suicide for an island nation reliant on maritime trade. The debates in the government liaison conferences were venomous. Yamamoto, usually a man of cool composure, used his sharp tongue to dismantle the army's logic. When army officers shouted that Germany was invincible, Yamamoto coldly reminded them that the British Navy was still the master of the seas, and that the American industrial machine had not yet even started its engine. He warned that the Tripartite Pact would be interpreted by Washington as a declaration of hostile intent, inevitably leading to an oil embargo, the very thing that would strangle the Navy. He was fighting not just for policy, but for the survival of his fleet. This defiance came at a terrifying personal cost. The atmosphere in Tokyo was thick with the threat of government by assassination, a legacy of the chaotic 1930s, where moderate politicians were frequently murdered by right-wing fanatics. Yamamoto became the primary target of this hatred. His office was flooded with hate mail, letters written in blood accusing him of being a coward, a traitor, and a lover of American decadence. The ultranationalists put a bounty on his head, and rumors swirled through the tea houses and barracks that a patriotic assassin was already sharpening his blade for the vice minister. The danger became so acute that Yamamoto's daily life resembled that of a man under siege. He could no longer walk freely in the city he served. Military police were stationed around his residence, and he slept with a loaded revolver on his nightstand. Yet, despite the crosshairs painted on his back, he refused to back down. He famously wrote in a letter to a friend that a man should not fear death in the service of his beliefs, comparing himself to a flower that blossoms and falls in its own time. His stoicism in the face of these death threats only enraged his enemies further. However, the political tide was a tsunami that not even Yamamoto could hold back. The fall of France in 1940 emboldened the pro-Axis factions to a hysterical degree. The pressure on the Navy Ministry became unbearable. The Army, utilizing its constitutional power to dissolve the cabinet by withdrawing its minister, maneuvered to topple the moderate government. Minister Yanai was forced out, and the political barrier that Yamamoto had helped maintain crumbled. The new cabinet was filled with men eager to shake hands with Hitler. On September 27, 1940, the Tripartite Pact was signed in Berlin. In Tokyo, the streets erupted in orchestrated celebrations. Lantern parades wound through the city, and citizens waved flags of the rising sun alongside the swastika, cheering for the new order. Yamamoto watched these festivities with a profound sense of doom. He did not see a celebration. He saw a funeral procession for the Japanese Empire. He knew that the signature on that document had just started a countdown to a war with the United States, a war he had spent his entire career trying to avoid. In the aftermath, the new Navy leadership faced a dilemma: what to do with the stubborn vice minister who had so publicly opposed the alliance. Leaving Yamamoto in Tokyo was a death sentence. The right-wing assassins were still baying for his blood. In a move that was part promotion and part protective custody, the Navy minister appointed Yamamoto as commander-in-chief of the combined fleet and ordered him to sea. It was the only place he would be safe from his own countrymen. As Yamamoto boarded his flagship, the battleship Nagato, he felt a bitter irony washing over him. He was being sent away to prepare the Navy for the very conflict he had warned against. The ocean air was cleaner than the poisonous political atmosphere of Tokyo, but the horizon was dark. He told a colleague that by signing the pact, Japan had broken the spine of its diplomacy. He knew that from this moment on, the helm was locked, and the ship was steering straight toward the iceberg. The chapter of opposition had closed, and the chapter of inevitable tragedy had begun. Yamamoto, the man who hated the idea of this war more than anyone, was now the only man capable of fighting it. As the Nagato steamed out of the harbor, leaving the cheering, deluded crowds of Tokyo behind, Yamamoto turned his gaze eastward toward the Pacific, his mind already churning with the terrifying mathematics of Pearl Harbor. He had failed to save the peace. Now, he had to try to save the Navy. In the summer of 1941, the delicate thread holding the peace of the Pacific together finally snapped. Emboldened by the fall of France and pressured by the Imperial Army to secure resources, Japan made the fateful decision to occupy the southern part of French Indochina. To the militarists in Tokyo, this was a strategic necessity to cut off supply lines to China. To Washington, it was an act of naked aggression that threatened the Philippines and British Malaya. From the deck of his flagship, Admiral Yamamoto watched the troop movements with a sinking heart. He knew that the United States had drawn a line in the sand, and Japan had just marched an army across it. The American response was swift, devastating, and total. On July 26, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an executive order freezing all Japanese assets in the United States. In a coordinated move, Britain and the Netherlands followed suit. The financial arteries of the empire were severed instantly. Japanese ships in American ports were seized, and trade ground to a halt. But the true catastrophe was the inclusion of oil in the embargo. The black blood that powered the Imperial Navy, 80% of which came from American wells, was cut off. The tap was twisted shut, and silence fell over the fuel depots of Japan. For Yamamoto, the embargo was the nightmare scenario he had predicted for years coming to life. He looked at the fuel gauges of the combined fleet and saw them transform into hourglasses. Every day the fleet sat at anchor, it burned oil. Every training flight consumed aviation fuel that could not be replaced. The Navy estimated they had roughly 18 months of reserves. After that, the battleships would be nothing more than floating steel islands, and the planes would be grounded paperweights. The embargo didn't just hurt Japan. It put a literal death date on the empire's military capability. The psychological impact on the Japanese high command was one of panic and claustrophobia. They felt encircled by what they called the ABCD line, American, British, Chinese, and Dutch forces tightening a noose around the archipelago. The army, blinded by pride, refused to see the embargo as a consequence of their own aggression. Instead, they viewed it as an unprovoked act of economic warfare, a challenge to the emperor's sovereignty. The logic of the cornered animal took over. If they did nothing, they would slowly strangle to death. If they fought, they might die, but they had a slim chance of breaking out. Diplomats in Washington, led by Ambassador Kichisaburo Nomura, frantically tried to negotiate a lifting of the sanctions. But the gap between the two nations was a canyon. The United States demanded a full withdrawal from China and Indochina, a humiliation the Imperial Army would never accept. Japan demanded a resumption of oil shipments, a concession the U.S. would never grant to an aggressor. Yamamoto watched these negotiations from afar, reading the cables with a deepening gloom. He knew that diplomacy was becoming a charade to buy time for the inevitable. The breaking point arrived on November 26, 1941, in the form of the Hull Note. Delivered by U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the document was a reiteration of American demands for Japan to withdraw from China and Indochina completely. In Washington, it was seen as a firm statement of principles. In Tokyo, it was interpreted as an ultimatum. The Prime Minister and the military chiefs viewed the note as a demand for unconditional surrender without fighting. The choice was framed starkly: give up Japan's status as a great power and retreat in shame, or fight for national survival. In the solemn, hushed chambers of the Imperial Palace, the decision was made. The go order was whispered through the halls of power. The heavy machinery of war began to turn, no longer fueled by hope, but by desperation. Yamamoto, who had argued until his voice was hoarse that a war with America was unwinnable, fell silent. The time for debate was over. The politician in him died, and the admiral took full command. If the politicians insisted on driving the car off the cliff, he would ensure he was the one steering it on the way down. Yamamoto's strategic calculus shifted immediately from avoidance to execution. He knew that the only chance Japan had, a microscopic, fragile chance, was to strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet so hard in the opening hours that American morale would shatter. The plan for Pearl Harbor, which had been a theoretical exercise in his mind, became a concrete operational order. He wrote to a friend that he felt like a man who was being forced to set fire to his own house to keep warm, knowing that eventually the fire would consume him too. The fleet began to gather in the cold, misty waters of Haida-Kapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. The location was chosen for its isolation. Strict radio silence was imposed. The sailors shivered in the northern chill, unaware of their final destination, sensing only the gravity of the moment. Yamamoto remained in the inland sea, coordinating the massive movement of ships across the emptiness of the North Pacific. He was sending his children, the pilots and sailors he had trained, into the maw of the giant. As the final days of November ticked away, the deadline for diplomacy passed. The task force weighed anchor, slipping into the gray fog of the Pacific Ocean. There was no turning back. The oil embargo had forced the hand of the empire, and Yamamoto, the man who knew better, had set the clock running. The prophecy he had made, that he would run wild for 6 months, was about to begin. The world held its breath, unaware that the reluctant warrior had just unleashed a storm. The atmosphere inside the Prime Minister's official residence was suffocating, heavy with the scent of stale tobacco and impending doom. It was September 1940, a time when the drums of war were beating so loudly in Tokyo that they drowned out all reason. Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono, a man of aristocratic lineage but fragile constitution, sat behind his heavy oak desk, looking more like a prisoner than a leader. He was trapped between the aggressive demands of the Imperial Army and the terrifying uncertainty of the future. In a desperate bid for clarity, he had summoned the one man who dared to speak the truth, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. When Yamamoto entered the room, he brought with him the cold, bracing air of reality. He did not bow and scrape like the sycophantic politicians who usually filled Kono's office. He stood straight, his naval uniform immaculate, his face a mask of grim determination. He knew why he was there. The government was teetering on the edge of signing the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, a move that would almost certainly lead to war with the United States. Kono, wavering and anxious, needed to know if the Navy could actually win such a war. Kono gestured for the admiral to sit, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of a document. He finally asked the question that had been keeping him awake at night. "Admiral," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "if we enter into this alliance and it leads to war with America and Britain, what is the Navy's outlook? Can we win?" The room fell silent. It was the most important question asked in the history of modern Japan, and the fate of millions hung on the answer. Yamamoto did not answer immediately. He looked at the Prime Minister, measuring the man's resolve. He could have offered a comforting lie. He could have spoken of the invincible imperial spirit, as the army generals did. But Yamamoto respected the gravity of war too much to lie about it. He took a breath, steeling himself to deliver a verdict he knew would not be welcome. His eyes locked onto Kono's, and he spoke with a chilling precision that would echo through history. "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences," Yamamoto said, his voice steady and devoid of emotion, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like smoke. "I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories. I will destroy their fleets and take their islands." Kono's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope sparking in his chest at the promise of victory. But then Yamamoto delivered the crushing second half of his prophecy. Leaning forward, his expression darkening, he continued, "But I must tell you that should the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." The spark in Kono's eyes died instantly. Yamamoto was not promising triumph. He was promising a temporary mirage followed by total ruin. He was effectively saying that Japan could win the sprint, but it would inevitably die in the marathon. Yamamoto then elaborated, dismantling the Prime Minister's hopes with cold logic. He explained that the United States was not merely a country, but an industrial monster. He described the vast shipyards of the East Coast and the auto factories of the Midwest. He warned that while the Japanese Navy was currently superior in training and spirit, it could not replace its losses. "We can sink their ships," Yamamoto argued, "but they will build 2 more for every one we sink. We are breaking a window, They are rebuilding the house. The admiral then made a personal plea, shedding his military stoicism for a moment of raw human urgency. "Mr. Prime Minister," he said, "I beg of you, do not sign this pact. Do not start this war. Diplomacy is the only way to save the empire." It was a stunning admission from the nation's top naval commander, a soldier begging a politician not to let him fight. He was essentially telling Kono that the military solution was a suicide pact. Kono listened, pale and shaken. He understood the intellectual weight of Yamamoto's words, but he lacked the political spine to act on them. The army was already too powerful. The ultranationalists were too loud. To stop the slide toward war now would require a strength that Kono simply did not possess. He nodded slowly, thanking the admiral for his candor, but Yamamoto could see the resignation in the prime minister's eyes. The warning had been heard, but it would not be heeded. Yamamoto stood up, saluted, and turned to leave. As he walked out of the residence and into the cool Tokyo night, he felt a profound sense of loneliness. He had done his duty. He had told the truth to power. But as the heavy doors clicked shut behind him, he knew the die was cast. The 6 months clock was already ticking in his mind. He had predicted the rise and fall of his own country in a single sentence, and now, tragically, he would be the one forced to execute the very war he had just condemned. The phrase hung in the air of Admiral Yamamoto's cabin like a thick fog, refusing to dissipate. "I shall run wild for 6 months." It was no longer just a warning given to a politician. It had become the architect's blueprint for the entire Pacific War. Alone in his quarters aboard the flagship Nagato, Yamamoto stared at the calendar, his mind turning the prophecy over and over. He knew that he had defined the exact boundaries of his own success. To anyone else, 6 months of victory sounded like a promise of glory. To Yamamoto, it was a terrifyingly short fuse on a stick of dynamite. He understood that this time frame was not arbitrary. It was a mathematical calculation based on the industrial lag time of the United States. Yamamoto knew that the American giant was currently asleep, its factories producing toasters and sedans. Once the first bomb dropped, it would take the U.S. roughly 6 months to wake up, retool its assembly lines, and mobilize its manpower. During that window of transition, Japan would have free rein. But the moment that window closed, the moment Detroit started building tanks instead of cars, the tide would turn with the unstoppable force of gravity. This realization forced Yamamoto to completely rewrite the Japanese Navy's traditional playbook. For decades, the Naval General Staff had trained for the decisive battle doctrine, a defensive strategy where they would lure the American fleet across the Pacific, whittling them down with submarines before destroying them in a grand battle near Japanese waters. Yamamoto threw this plan into the trash. He realized that a defensive war was a long war, and a long war was a lost war. To utilize his 6-month window, he had to go on the offensive immediately. He had to punch first, and he had to punch hard. The definition of running wild meant two simultaneous, colossal undertakings. First, the army would have to surge south to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber plantations of Malaya. This was the resource grab necessary to keep the empire breathing. But Yamamoto knew that this southern flank would be exposed to the U.S. Pacific Fleet stationed in Hawaii. This led to the second, more dangerous part of the equation, the neutralization of that threat. He couldn't just capture territory. He had to break the policeman's baton before he could rob the bank. As he drafted the operational orders, Yamamoto drove his men with a manic intensity. The training schedules for the combined fleet became brutal. Pilots flew until they passed out from exhaustion. Gunners ran drills until their hands bled. His subordinates believed they were training for glorious conquest, but Yamamoto was training them for a sprint against time. He knew that the proficiency of his pilots, the best in the world at that moment, was a wasting asset. Every pilot lost in the first 6 months could not be replaced with equal quality, whereas the Americans would eventually swarm the skies with sheer numbers. The phrase "run wild" also concealed a deep personal fatalism. In a letter to Ryoichi Sasakawa, a nationalist leader, Yamamoto wrote with chilling clarity, "I expect to die on the bridge of my flagship." He did not envision a victory parade in Washington, D.C., or a triumphant return to Tokyo. He saw the 6 months as a period of sacrificial violence. His goal was not to conquer the United States. He knew that was impossible, but to inflict so much pain and shock during that half year that the Americans would lose the stomach for the fight and agree to a negotiated peace. It was a gamble on American psychology, not American geography. However, the burden of this prophecy isolated him. In the officers' mess, younger commanders toasted to the coming war with sake, speaking of the samurai spirit and the divine wind. Yamamoto would sit quietly, sipping his tea, looking at faces he knew would likely be dead within a year. They heard victory. He heard deadline. When they spoke of the weak American resolve, Yamamoto remembered the steel mills of Pittsburgh. He was a man watching his children play in the path of a storm, unable to grab them and run, forced instead to hand them umbrellas. As the weeks turned into days, the 6-month clock began to tick louder in his head. The diplomatic cables from Washington grew colder, and the preparations for the Pearl Harbor strike force entered their final stages. Yamamoto reviewed the plans for the attack on Hawaii with a perfectionist's eye. He knew that if the opening move failed, if he didn't run wild from day one, the war was lost immediately. There was no margin for error. The prophecy demanded absolute perfection just to buy a chance at survival. The tragedy of the situation was that Yamamoto's brilliance was now working against him. By devising such a lethal, effective opening strategy, he was ensuring that the war would happen. If he had been a less competent commander, perhaps the government would have hesitated. But because he promised them 6 months of running wild, the politicians felt safe enough to jump off the cliff. He had given them the confidence to commit suicide. On the eve of the war, Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the deck of the Nagato, looking out at the dark ocean. The order was about to be given. The prophecy was about to be tested. He knew that he would indeed run wild, that the headlines would scream of Japanese victories, and that the world would tremble. But he also knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen the future, that when the 6th month ended, the silence would stop and the thunder would begin. In the quiet solitude of his cabin, Admiral Yamamoto stared at a map of the Pacific Ocean until his eyes burned. The conventional wisdom of the Japanese Navy, etched into every officer's mind for 30 years, was the great all-out battle strategy. This doctrine dictated that Japan should wait, luring the American fleet across the ocean into a trap near Japanese waters. But Yamamoto knew that this passive strategy was a relic of a bygone era. Against the industrial might of the United States, waiting was not a strategy. It was a death sentence. To survive, Japan had to project power across 3,500 miles of ocean. He had to reach out and break the enemy's jaw before the fight even started. The seed of the idea was radical, bordering on heresy. Yamamoto envisioned an aerial strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet while it lay at anchor in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. When he first whispered this concept to his few trusted confidants, they looked at him as if he had lost his mind. Hawaii was a fortress, bristling with coastal guns and surrounded by the open, unforgiving ocean. No navy in history had ever launched a carrier strike of that magnitude over such a vast distance. It was logistically impossible, tactically suicidal, and strategically unprecedented. But Yamamoto saw something others missed. The very impossibility of the attack was its greatest strength. The Americans would never expect it because no sane commander would attempt it. To turn this fevered dream into a reality, Yamamoto summoned Commander Minoru Genda, a brilliant, eccentric airman known as the Madman of the Navy. Genda was a visionary who believed that aircraft carriers, not battleships, were the new kings of the sea. When Yamamoto presented the problem to him, Genda didn't flinch at the audacity. He was energized by it. He studied the maps and the capabilities of the Zero fighter and the Kate bomber. After weeks of calculation, he returned to Yamamoto with a verdict. It is difficult, but it is not impossible. With those words, the planning for Operation Z began. The technical challenges, however, were nightmarish. The most glaring issue was the depth of Pearl Harbor. The water in the harbor was only about 40 feet deep. Standard aerial torpedoes, when dropped from a plane, would plunge 70 or 100 feet underwater before leveling off. In Pearl Harbor, they would simply bury themselves in the mud of the ocean floor. Without torpedoes, the attack would be toothless against the thick armor of the American battleships. The plan seemed dead in the water. But Japanese engineers, driven by desperation, devised a genius solution. They attached wooden fins to the torpedoes to increase their buoyancy and trained pilots to drop them at dangerously low altitudes. They turned the impossible into a physics problem, and then they solved it. Another hurdle was the journey itself. To reach Hawaii undetected, the fleet would have to sail across the northern Pacific, a route known for violent winter storms and thick fog. It was a route that merchant ships avoided, which made it perfect for a surprise attack. But this meant refueling heavily laden ships in rough seas, a maneuver that had never been attempted on this scale. The logistical officers screamed that the destroyers would run out of fuel and be left drifting. Yamamoto overruled them. He ordered the training to include refueling in heavy swells, pushing his sailors to the breaking point. He was betting the entire fleet on the skill of his coxswains. Back in Tokyo, the Naval General Staff was in an uproar. Admiral Osamu Nagano, the chief of the Naval General Staff, vehemently opposed the plan. He argued that risking the Kido Butai, the entirety of Japan's carrier strength, on a single roll of the dice was reckless. The traditionalists wanted to keep the fleet close to home to protect the emperor. The arguments in the war room were fierce, with shouting matches that echoed down the halls. They called Yamamoto a gambler who was risking the national treasure on a fantasy. Yamamoto, usually a man of consensus, finally played his trump card. He sent a message to the high command that was blunt and final. If this plan is not approved, I will resign as commander-in-chief and return to civilian life. The threat paralyzed the general staff. Yamamoto was the idol of the fleet. His resignation on the eve of war would destroy morale. Reluctantly, grudgingly, Nagano relented. He gave the approval, muttering that if they were going to fight a desperate war, perhaps a desperate strategy was the only way. With a green light given, the preparation shifted to Kagoshima Bay in southern Japan. The geography of the bay bore a striking resemblance to Pearl Harbor, and it became the stage for the dress rehearsal of the apocalypse. Day after day, torpedo bombers roared over the city, dropping their dummy payloads at treetop level. The citizens of Kagoshima watched in awe, unaware that the terrifying display above their heads was a practice run for the start of a world war. The pilots flew with a fanatical precision, knowing that one mistake in Hawaii would mean failure for the entire operation. Secrecy was paramount. The ships of the task force slipped away from their home ports one by one, converging on Haidokapa Bay in the Kuril Islands, a desolate, frozen outpost at the edge of the world. Radio silence was absolute. Key operators remained in Japan, tapping out fake radio traffic to fool American listening posts into thinking the fleet was still in home waters. Yamamoto had created a phantom fleet in the ether, while the real fleet, 6 carriers, 2 battleships, and a swarm of escorts, gathered in the freezing mist, waiting for the signal. As November 1941 drew to a close, the plan was locked. The torpedoes were modified, the tanks were full, and the pilots were ready. Yamamoto had taken an impossible idea and hammered it into a weapon of terrifying precision. He had designed the perfect surprise, a masterpiece of naval strategy. But as he signed the final operational order, he felt no joy. He knew that the success of this plan would wake the sleeping giant he feared so much. He had designed the impossible, but in doing so, he had ensured the inevitable destruction that would follow. The Pacific Ocean was pitch black, a void of churning water and howling wind. On the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, the pre-dawn air was thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and nervous sweat. It was the morning of December 7th, a Sunday. To the sailors bracing themselves against the rolling waves, it felt like the end of the world. To the pilots climbing into their cockpits, it was the beginning of a legend. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, commanding the task force, looked out at the rough seas with anxiety. The plan required precision, yet nature seemed determined to disrupt it. But as the signal flag dropped, The engines of hundreds of aircraft roared to life, spitting blue flames into the darkness, drowning out the sound of the ocean. One by one, the Zero fighters and Kate bombers clawed their way into the sky, dipping dangerously close to the wave tops before gaining altitude. It was a swarm of metal locusts, 183 planes in the first wave alone, banking south toward the island of Oahu. Leading the formation was Commander Mitsuo Fukuda. As he flew through the clouds, he watched the sun rise over the horizon, a literal rising sun, the emblem of his empire, casting a golden light over the peaceful waters below. For hours, they maintained radio silence, a ghost fleet in the sky, undetected by the Americans, who were just waking up to a lazy Hawaiian morning. Below them, Pearl Harbor was the picture of tranquility. The U.S. Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in Battleship Row, the ships lined up neatly in pairs like sitting ducks. Sailors were eating breakfast, reading newspapers, or preparing for church services. The bands were playing the Star-Spangled Banner for the morning colors ceremony. It was a paradise utterly unprepared for violence. When the Japanese planes first appeared on the radar of a remote station at Opana Point, the inexperienced operators dismissed them as a flight of American B-17 bombers arriving from the mainland. The giant was not just sleeping, it was comatose. At 7:49 a.m., Commander Fukuda looked down at the unsuspecting target and broke radio silence. Tora, 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 he shouted into his headset, the code indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The signal traveled across the ocean to the Nagato in Japan, where Yamamoto sat waiting. Moments later, the sky fell. The first bombs did not hit the ships, but the airfields. Wheeler and Hickam fields were engulfed in explosions as Japanese dive bombers strafed the neat rows of American aircraft parked wing to wing. Within minutes, the U.S. air defense was crippled on the ground, ensuring the Japanese would own the sky for the rest of the morning. Then, the Fury turned toward the harbor. Torpedo planes, utilizing the wooden fins Yamamoto's engineers had designed, dropped their payloads into the shallow water. The torpedoes ran true, slamming into the hulls of the great battleships. The USS Oklahoma took hit after hit, groaning as she capsized, trapping hundreds of men inside her dark, flooding hull. The sound of tearing metal and secondary explosions shattered the Sunday calm, replaced by the screams of the dying and the roar of infernos. The water of the harbor, usually a sparkling blue, turned black with oil and red with blood. The defining moment of horror came for the USS Arizona. A Japanese high-altitude bomber dropped an armor-piercing bomb that smashed through the ship's deck and ignited the forward ammunition magazine. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. The battleship was essentially lifted out of the water, her back broken, as a fireball rose hundreds of feet into the air. Over 1,000 sailors were vaporized or drowned in an instant. The shock wave was so powerful it extinguished the fires on adjacent ships. In that single blinding flash, the era of the battleship ended, and the fury of the United States began. Amidst the chaos, the American response was initially paralyzed by shock, then fueled by desperate heroism. Sailors ran to their battle stations in pajamas. Cooks manned anti-aircraft guns. Men swam through burning oil to save their shipmates. By the time the second wave of Japanese planes arrived an hour later, the sky was filled with black flak bursts. The element of surprise was gone. The second wave inflicted more damage, hammering the USS Nevada as she tried to make a run for the open sea, but the American resistance was stiffening. The easy war was already over. Back on the carrier Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced a critical decision. His pilots returned, flushed with victory, urging a third wave. They wanted to go back and destroy the massive oil storage tanks and the dry dock repair facilities. Destroying those would have forced the U.S. fleet to retreat to the west coast for months. But Nagumo was a cautious man. He had lost the element of surprise. He didn't know where the American aircraft carriers were, and he had accomplished his primary mission. He ordered the fleet to turn around and head for home. It was a tactical victory, but a strategic blunder that Yamamoto would later lament. The infrastructure of Pearl Harbor survived. Thousands of miles away, aboard the battleship Nagato, Admiral Yamamoto received the news with a complicated mix of relief and dread. The operation was a tactical masterpiece. He had pulled off the impossible. But then came the news that soured the victory. Due to a delay in decoding the message at the Japanese embassy in Washington, the formal declaration of war was delivered to the U.S. government after the attack had already begun. Yamamoto closed his eyes in pain. He had wanted a samurai-style duel, beginning with a formal challenge. Instead, he had delivered a sneak attack. He knew immediately that this perceived treachery would fill the Americans with a righteous, unquenchable rage. As the smoke cleared over Hawaii, the devastation was absolute. 2,403 Americans dead, 8 battleships damaged or sunk. The Japanese pilots celebrated, believing they had won the war in a single morning. But Yamamoto knew better. He knew they had only bought time. The prophecy had come to pass. He had run wild for the first day. But as he looked at the maps of the Pacific, he could almost feel the vibration of the American industrial machine beginning to shudder into life. The sleeping giant was awake, and it was filled with a terrible resolve. The smoke had barely cleared over the wreckage of Pearl Harbor when the second phase of Yamamoto's grand design erupted across the Pacific map. It was a synchronized explosion of violence that spanned thousands of miles, a logistical marvel that left the world breathless. In Tokyo, they called it the centrifugal offensive, but to the terrified Allied forces stationed in Asia, it felt like an unstoppable tidal wave. Yamamoto had promised to run wild, and in those first few weeks of 1942, the Imperial Japanese military moved with a speed and ferocity that made the German blitzkrieg in Europe look sluggish by comparison. The sun was rising everywhere at once. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur, paralyzed by the shock of the news from Hawaii, failed to act. Hours after Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers appeared over Clark Field. The American pilots, caught on the ground just like their naval counterparts in Hawaii, looked up to see the sky filled with the rising sun insignias. In a matter of minutes, the Far East Air Force, the main deterrent to Japanese invasion, was reduced to twisted aluminum and burning rubber. The meticulously trained Japanese pilots, flying their Agile Zeros, swept the skies clean, turning the American fortress into a trap. Simultaneously, a terrifying drama played out in the waters off Malaya that signaled the end of an era. The British Royal Navy, confident in the might of their battleships, had dispatched Force Z, the majestic HMS Prince of Wales, and the HMS Repulse, to intimidate the Japanese. They believed that battleships were unsinkable kings of the ocean. On December 10th, Japanese land-based bombers found them without air cover. In a shocking display of aerial dominance, the planes swarmed the great ships. Winston Churchill would later write that in all the war, he never received a more direct shock than the news that both ships had been sent to the bottom of the sea. The myth of European naval superiority in Asia vanished in bubbles of oil and blood. On the Malayan Peninsula, the Japanese army performed a feat of tactical brilliance. The British had anticipated a naval assault on Singapore, pointing their massive coastal guns out to sea. Instead, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya, attacked from the north, through the impenetrable jungle. His troops did not just march, they rode bicycles. Thousands of Japanese soldiers pedaled down rubber plantation trails, moving faster than the British could retreat, flanking defensive lines and sowing chaos. It was a modern war fought with humble tools, and the colonial defenders were completely outmaneuvered. The dominoes continued to fall with dizzying speed. Hong Kong, an outpost of the British Empire, surrendered on Christmas Day after a brutal siege. Wake Island, defended by a skeleton crew of U.S. Marines who fought with legendary grit, eventually succumbed to overwhelming numbers. The Pacific Ocean, once a vast buffer for the Allies, had become a Japanese lake. The speed of the conquest was so great that Japanese supply lines struggled to keep up with their own advancing front lines. They were conquering territory faster than they could print maps for it. The crown jewel of this rampage was the fall of Singapore in February 1942. The Gibraltar of the East, considered an impregnable fortress, crumbled from within. When General Arthur Percival surrendered the largest British garrison in history, over 80,000 men, to a numerically inferior Japanese force, the psychological shock was seismic. The image of the haggard British commander walking under a white flag to meet Yamashita shattered the myth of white supremacy in Asia forever. In Tokyo, the victory was celebrated with lantern parades and free sake. The empire seemed invincible. Crucially, the paratroopers of the Imperial Army descended upon Palembang in the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia. This was the true objective of the entire war, the oil refineries. Yamamoto breathed a sigh of relief as reports came in that the Dutch had failed to destroy the facilities completely. The black blood was now flowing into Japanese tankers. The resource strangulation that the U.S. embargo had attempted was broken. Japan had seized the treasury of Southeast Asia, securing the rubber, tin, and oil needed to fuel its war machine. Back in Japan, the mood was one of hysterical euphoria. The government and the public were intoxicated by the string of victories. They suffered from what Yamamoto cynically called victory disease. The generals began to believe their own propaganda, that the Americans were weak, that the British were finished, and that the spirit of the emperor was indeed guiding their bullets. They began to plan even grander expansions, talking of invading Australia or India, drunk on the illusion of infinite power. However, amidst the cheers and the toasts, Admiral Yamamoto remained a ghost at the banquet. He paced the deck of the Nagato, his face grim. He read the reports of the victories not with joy, but with the anxiety of a man watching a clock. He saw that the victories were easy, too easy. The Allies were retreating, but they were not annihilated. He noted that the American aircraft carriers, the primary targets of Pearl Harbor, were still floating somewhere in the vast Pacific, unscathed. He knew that the giant had been knocked down, but not knocked out. As the 6-month mark approached, Yamamoto felt the momentum beginning to stretch thin. The empire was now a bloated balloon, its perimeter expanded thousands of miles, impossible to defend everywhere at once. He knew the run wild phase was nearing its end. The initial sprint was over, and the grinding marathon he feared was about to begin. While Tokyo celebrated the dawn of a new age, Yamamoto looked at the calendar and saw the sunset approaching. The prophecy was half fulfilled. The tragedy was yet to come. By the spring of 1942, the map of the Pacific had been redrawn in the colors of the rising sun. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dismissed by Western observers as a regional force of imitators, now stood as the undisputed master of the ocean. From the icy waters of the Aleutians to the tropical heat of the Indian Ocean, there was not a single Allied fleet capable of challenging them. Admiral Yamamoto's prophecy of running wild had reached its zenith. To the Japanese public, it seemed as though the gods themselves were guiding the combined fleet, but for the Allied sailors in the region, the ocean had become a hunting ground where survival was measured in minutes. The humiliation of the West began in earnest in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, who had sworn to defend the islands, found his air force destroyed on the ground and his army outmaneuvered by the relentless General Masaru Homma. The American and Filipino troops were forced to retreat into the jungle peninsula of Bataan, a dead end, where disease and hunger proved to be deadlier enemies than Japanese bullets. Yamamoto's naval blockade tightened around the islands like a python. No food could get in. No reinforcements could arrive. The Pearl of the Orient was completely cut off from the world, and the American flag was lowered inch by agonizing inch. When Bataan finally fell, the resulting death march shocked the world with its brutality, but militarily, it signified something even more profound. The United States could not protect its own territory. The fall of the island fortress of Corregidor soon after was the final nail in the coffin. As General Jonathan Wainwright broadcast his surrender message, weeping openly, it marked the worst defeat in American military history. The Japanese Navy controlled the shipping lanes so completely that the mighty U.S. Army was reduced to a starving, isolated pocket of resistance, forced to bow before the emperor. Meanwhile, to the south, the British Empire was suffering its own death throes. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, was the linchpin of British power in Asia. It was supposed to be impregnable, a fortress of massive coastal guns and naval supremacy. But the Japanese army, supported by Yamamoto's naval air power, dismantled the myth of British invincibility in weeks. They poured down the Malayan Peninsula, moving through impassable jungles and capturing the water reservoirs. The city, crowded with refugees and choking on smoke, had nowhere to run. On February 15, 1942, the unthinkable happened. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, the British commander, walked under a white flag to the Ford Motor Factory to surrender to General Yamashita. It was a scene that overturned centuries of colonial history. The British Empire, which had ruled the waves for so long, was surrendering its greatest fortress to an Asian power. The fall of Singapore was not just a military loss. It was a psychological earthquake. It stripped the West of its prestige and proved that the Imperial Navy was now the supreme arbiter of power in the region. To cement this dominance, the Japanese Navy turned its sights on the remaining Allied ships desperately trying to defend the Dutch East Indies. This loose coalition of American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships, known as Abdicom, sailed out to meet the Japanese juggernaut in the Java Sea. It was a massacre. The Japanese heavy cruisers, armed with the terrifyingly effective Long Lance torpedoes, decimated the Allied fleet in a series of night battles. The sea floor was littered with the wreckage of Allied cruisers, and the survivors were left drifting in shark-infested waters. With the destruction of the ABDA fleet, the southern resource area was secured. The oil of Indonesia, the rubber of Malaya, and the tin of Thailand were now flowing freely to the factories in Japan. Yamamoto had achieved his primary strategic objective. The shipping lanes were open, the tankers were full, and the perimeter was secure. In Tokyo, the celebration was raucous. The government declared a new order in East Asia, and the generals began to speak of invading India and Australia. They believed the war was effectively won. However, amidst this intoxication, Yamamoto remained the sober designated driver. He observed the victory disease, Senshobio, infecting his staff, a dangerous cocktail of arrogance and complacency. Officers began to plan careless operations, believing the Americans were too demoralized to fight back. Yamamoto knew better. He looked at the vastness of the ocean he now mastered and saw not a prize, but a vulnerability. He knew that holding this massive perimeter would stretch the Navy to its breaking point. He was also haunted by what was missing from the picture. The American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Lexington, the Yorktown, were still ghosts. They had not been at Pearl Harbor, and they had not been caught in the Philippines or the Java Sea. Yamamoto knew that as long as those flight decks remained afloat, his mastery of the ocean was an illusion. He had cut off the lizard's tail, but the head was still snapping. He warned his staff that the silence from the east was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of a gathering storm. As the 6-month mark of his prophecy approached, the Imperial Japanese Navy stood at the height of its power. They had accomplished more in half a year than anyone had thought possible. But Yamamoto sensed the shift in the wind. He knew that the easy phase was over. He was a master of the ocean, yes, but he was a master standing on a surfboard, riding a massive wave that was about to crash against the immovable object of American industrial resolve. By April 1942, Tokyo was a city basking in the warm glow of spring and the even warmer glow of invincibility. The cherry blossoms were falling, and the newspapers were filled daily with headlines of new conquests in the South Seas. The empire's defensive perimeter now stretched thousands of miles into the Pacific, a vast buffer zone that the military assured the public was impenetrable. To the average citizen, the war was a glorious, distant event, something happening on maps, not in their backyards. Admiral Yamamoto, however, did not share this comfort. He knew that the ocean was a highway, not a wall, and he remained vigilant aboard the Nagato, waiting for the counterpunch he knew was coming. Meanwhile, deep in the tossing gray swells of the North Pacific, a plan of desperate audacity was unfolding aboard the USS Hornet. Lieutenant Colonel James "Jimmy" Doolittle stood on the heaving flight deck, looking at 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers crammed onto the ship. These were land-based medium bombers, never designed to take off from an aircraft carrier. They were heavy, lumbering beasts compared to the nimble naval fighters. The plan was a suicide mission in all but name: fly these heavy planes off a short deck, bomb Tokyo, and hope to reach friendly airfields in China before the fuel ran out. It was a mission born not of strategy, but of a psychological need to prove that the Japanese home islands were not untouchable. The mission went wrong before it even began. On the morning of April 18th, the task force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat, the Nido Maru. Although the USS Nashville quickly sank the small vessel, the Americans had to assume a warning radio message had been sent. They were still 650 miles from Japan, far beyond the safe range of the bombers. Doolittle faced a terrible choice: abort the mission and push the planes into the sea to clear the deck for fighters, or launch immediately and risk running out of fuel over the ocean. Without hesitation, Doolittle gave the order: Army pilots, man your planes. One by one, the B-25s revved their engines to maximum power, their frames shaking against the brakes. As the carrier pitched into a deep swell, Doolittle released the brakes. The first bomber lumbered down the deck, the end of the runway rushing toward it. To the terrified sailors watching, it looked like the plane would drop straight into the sea. But at the last second, Doolittle pulled the stick back, and the bomber clawed its way into the air, clearing the waves by mere feet. 15 more miracles followed. The Doolittle Raiders were airborne, skimming the wave tops to avoid radar, heading straight for the heart of the empire. Around noon, the low rumble of twin engines began to echo over Tokyo. At first, no one panicked. The citizens assumed it was an air raid drill or perhaps a flyover of new Japanese prototypes. People on the ground actually waved at the planes, admiring their formation. The illusion shattered instantly when the bomb bay doors opened. Explosions erupted across the industrial districts, tearing through factories and oil tanks. The sirens, which had remained silent, finally began to wail. For the first time in centuries, the sacred soil of Japan was being violated by a foreign enemy. Aboard the flagship Nagato, anchored safely in Hashirajima, the news hit Admiral Yamamoto like a physical blow to the stomach. Officers rushed into his quarters with pale faces, clutching the telegrams. Enemy planes over Tokyo. The report was inconceivable. Where had they come from? There were no American carriers reported within range. When Yamamoto learned that the raid had occurred, he was overcome with a deep, nausea-inducing shame. He retreated to his cabin, refusing to eat. In the code of the samurai, his primary duty was not to win battles, but to safeguard the person of the emperor. He had failed. The physical damage caused by the Doolittle raid was negligible: a few factories damaged, some oil fires, and tragic civilian casualties. But the psychological damage was nuclear. The bombs had fallen just a few miles from the imperial palace. The idea that the emperor, a living god, had been exposed to mortal danger shook the Japanese high command to its core. The myth of the divine wind that protected Japan was evaporated. The army and navy, previously drunk on their own success, were suddenly gripped by paranoia. The ocean barrier had been breached. The raid effectively ended the strategic paralysis in Tokyo. For months, Yamamoto had been arguing for an aggressive operation to capture Midway Island, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific, to lure the American carriers into a decisive trap. The Naval General Staff had resisted, calling it too risky and unnecessary. But after Doolittle, the debate ended. The Army and the General Staff, terrified of another raid on the capital, gave Yamamoto a blank check. They needed to extend the defensive perimeter, and they needed to destroy the American carriers that had launched those bombers. For the raiders themselves, the mission ended in a mixture of heroism and tragedy. Running on fumes, most of the crews bailed out over China or crash-landed in rice paddies. Some were rescued by Chinese guerrillas, others were captured, tortured, and executed by the Japanese army. The Japanese retaliation against the Chinese provinces that helped the Americans was horrific, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians. It was a blood price paid for a symbolic victory, but the message had been delivered. Nowhere was safe. As the smoke cleared from Tokyo, the trajectory of the war shifted irrevocably. The 6-month clock that Yamamoto heard ticking was now deafening. The Doolittle raid had forced his hand. He was no longer acting on his own timetable. He was reacting to the Americans. Driven by shame and a desperate need to redeem his honor, Yamamoto began to marshal the entire strength of the combined fleet for the operation that was supposed to secure Japan's safety forever. He set his sights on Midway, unaware that in his rush to protect the emperor, he was sailing his fleet directly into the catastrophe he had predicted. By May 1942, the calendar hanging in Admiral Yamamoto's cabin had become his most terrifying enemy. Every time he tore off a page, the sound seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet of his quarters. It had been 5 months since Pearl Harbor. The Imperial Navy had rampaged across the Pacific, conquering an empire that stretched from the Aleutians to Australia, just as he had promised. But the 6 months he had prophesied to Prime Minister Kono were evaporating. The sand in the hourglass was running low, and Yamamoto could feel the momentum shifting. He knew that the window of opportunity to force the United States into a negotiated peace was closing, and once it shut, it would be sealed forever. The Doolittle raid in April had injected a frantic, poisonous energy into the Naval General Staff. The cool calculation of the early war was replaced by a desperate rush to extend the defensive perimeter. Yamamoto, usually a man of patience, was now driving his staff with a feverish intensity. He was obsessed with the idea of drawing the American carriers, the missing pieces of Pearl Harbor, into a final decisive battle. He believed that if he could sink the USS Enterprise and Hornet, he might buy Japan another year of time. But to do this, he had to launch Operation MI, the invasion of Midway, before the American industrial machine fully woke up. He was racing against the smokestacks of Detroit. However, the fleet that Yamamoto commanded was beginning to show the cracks of fatigue. For half a year, the ships of the Kito Butai had steamed tens of thousands of miles, fighting in the tropics and the cold north. The crews were exhausted, the machinery was worn, and the pilots were fraying at the edges. Logistics officers begged for time to overhaul the engines and rest the men, but Yamamoto refused. He couldn't afford a pause. He knew that every day the Japanese fleet sat in dry dock was a day the Americans spent building new carriers. The 6-month deadline demanded that they push the machinery of war past its breaking point. Inside the briefing rooms of the battleship Yamato, a dangerous psychological malady had taken hold. Victory disease. The junior officers, intoxicated by the string of easy conquests, had lost their capacity for critical thinking. They began to view the Americans as incompetent and cowardly. During the war games held to simulate the Midway operation, the staff displayed a shocking arrogance. When a referee ruled that 2 Japanese carriers had been sunk by American land-based bombers during the simulation, the presiding officer simply overturned the ruling, resurrecting the ships and declaring, "The Americans are not capable of such a feat." Yamamoto watched this farce in silence, his stomach churning with anxiety. He saw that his navy was preparing to fight the enemy they wanted, not the enemy that actually existed. While the Japanese officers adjusted the rules of their war games to ensure victory, a very real battle was being fought in the basement of a naval headquarters in Hawaii. Commander Joe Rockefort and his team of cryptanalysts were working around the clock in a windowless dungeon, piecing together fragments of the Japanese Naval Code, JN-25. While Yamamoto believed he was moving his pieces in total secrecy, the Americans were reading his mail. They knew the objective was AF Midway, and they knew the rough timeline. The element of surprise, the cornerstone of Yamamoto's strategy, had evaporated before the first ship even weighed anchor. The hunter was becoming the hunted. Yamamoto's personal health began to mirror the deterioration of his strategic situation. The stress of the 6-month prophecy was eating him alive. He suffered from chronic stomach pains and insomnia, spending long nights writing letters to his favorite geisha, Chiyoko, in which he poured out his fatalism. He wrote not like a conqueror, but like a man saying goodbye. He sensed that the luck he had relied on at the poker table was running out. He told his staff that he expected to lead the Midway operation from the front, perhaps hoping that a glorious death in battle would spare him from witnessing the slow collapse of the empire he foresaw. The complexity of the Midway plan itself was a symptom of this desperation. Yamamoto designed an operation so intricate it resembled a Swiss watch, involving feints to the Aleutian Islands, submarine cordons, and multiple task forces spread over thousands of miles of ocean. It relied on perfect timing and the assumption that the Americans would react exactly as predicted. It was a plan born of overconfidence and anxiety, too complex to fail, and therefore destined to fail. He was trying to script a battle like a stage play, forgetting that the enemy also gets a vote. As the preparations reached their climax, the first stumble occurred in the Coral Sea in early May. It was the first time the Japanese Navy had been checked. Although they sank the USS Lexington, they lost the light carrier Shoho, and more critically, the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku were battered and depleted. They would not be available for the Midway operation. For the first time, the Running Wild had hit a wall. Yamamoto ignored this warning sign, pressing ahead with the Midway plan, believing that 4 carriers would be enough. The clock was ticking too loudly for him to wait for repairs. On May 27, 1942, the anniversary of the great victory at Tsushima, the combined fleet set sail. It was the largest armada ever assembled in the history of Asia. As Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the colossal battleship Yamato, he looked out at the endless horizon of gray steel, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and the precious carriers. It looked invincible. The sailors cheered, believing they were sailing to another easy victory. But Yamamoto felt the cold spray of the ocean and the even colder weight of the truth. He looked at the calendar one last time. The 6 months were up. The period of grace he had promised the emperor had expired. He was now sailing into borrowed time. As the massive prow of the Yamato cut through the waves, heading east toward destiny, Yamamoto knew that the easy days were over. He was no longer running wild. He was running straight into the trap that the industrial giant, now fully awake, had set for him. The prophecy was complete. Now came the reckoning. In early May 1942, the smooth, unstoppable machine of the Imperial Japanese conquest finally hit a patch of rough gravel. Operation MO, the plan to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea and threaten Australia, was supposed to be another routine exercise in expansion. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the situation from his flagship, viewed it as a necessary flank-clearing move before the main event at Midway. But as the Japanese task force steamed into the humid, cloud-choked waters of the Coral Sea, they were not sailing into a vacuum as they had in the past. They were sailing into the first true test of modern naval warfare, a chaotic brawl that would change the rules of engagement forever. For the first time in history, a naval battle was about to be fought without the opposing ships ever seeing one another. The days of battleships lining up to exchange broadsides were dead. This was a new, terrifying form of combat, a duel of ghosts fought over the horizon by buzzing swarms of aircraft. The Japanese commanders, confident to the point of arrogance, believed they were invisible. They did not know that the Americans, armed with the broken JN-25 naval code, were already waiting for them. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had positioned the carriers Lexington and Yorktown in the ambush spot, turning the hunter into the prey. The battle opened with a series of clumsy, violent blunders that highlighted the fog of war. The pilots on both sides, nerves frayed by the high stakes, misidentified targets in the tropical haze. On May 7th, American planes swarmed the light carrier Shoho, mistaking her for a main fleet carrier. The small ship was obliterated, hit by so many torpedoes and bombs that she sank in minutes. The radio message from the American commander echoed across the Pacific. Scratch one flat top. It was a shocking jolt to the Japanese Navy. It was the first time they had lost a carrier, a crack in the armor of their perceived invincibility. The main event exploded on May 8th, a day of confusion and high explosives. The two carrier forces, separated by 200 miles of ocean, launched their strikes almost simultaneously. The Japanese pilots, elite veterans of Pearl Harbor, found the USS Lexington, the beloved Lady Lex, and the Yorktown. They danced through the heavy American anti-aircraft fire, planting torpedoes and bombs into the massive ships. The Lexington was convulsed by explosions. Her aviation fuel lines ruptured. To the Japanese aviators circling above, the burning giant looked like a confirmed kill, a trophy to bring home to the emperor. Meanwhile, the American strike force had found the Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. The Zuikaku managed to hide beneath a providential rain squall, disappearing from sight like a phantom. The Shokaku was not so lucky. American dive bombers screamed down from the clouds, planting massive bombs into her flight deck. The deck curled back like peeled metal, and the hangar deck turned into an inferno. The ship, which had terrorized the Indian Ocean just weeks before, was left burning and listing, forced to limp away from the battlefield. As the sun set, both sides withdrew, licking their wounds. In terms of simple arithmetic, the Japanese claimed a tactical victory. They had sunk the fleet carrier Lexington, a tanker, and a destroyer, while losing only the light carrier Shoho. The Japanese newspapers trumpeted another glorious triumph, claiming the American Navy had been crushed. But in the private quarters of the High Command, the mood was somber. The invasion of Port Moresby, the actual goal of the operation, had been abandoned. The unstoppable Japanese tide had, for the first time, been turned back. The true disaster for Yamamoto, however, was not in the ship sunk, but in the ships sidelined. The Shokaku was heavily damaged and would require months of repairs. The Zuikaku, while physically intact, had lost so many planes and pilots that she was essentially a floating hotel with no teeth. She would have to return to Japan to train new air groups, a slow and painful process. These two heavy carriers, the newest and most powerful in the fleet, would not be available for the upcoming Midway operation. Yamamoto received the after-action reports with a deepening sense of dread. He realized that the Americans were learning. They were no longer the panicked novices of Pearl Harbor. They were fighting back with aggression and skill. The spirit of the Japanese pilots was being matched by the resilience of American damage control and the lethality of their code breaking. The ocean, which had felt so wide and safe just months ago, was suddenly feeling claustrophobic. The 6-month window was closing, and the Americans had just jammed their foot in the door. The strategic cost of a Coral Sea was catastrophic for Japan, though few realized it at the moment. Yamamoto was planning to bring 6 carriers to smash the Americans at Midway. Now, because of the damage to Shokaku and the pilot losses of Zuikaku, he would only have 4. He had traded a tactical win in a secondary theater for a strategic disadvantage in the decisive battle. He had spent his capital on a side bet, leaving him short for the main game. As the battered remnants of the task force limped back to truck, the aura of Japanese invincibility had been punctured. They had stumbled. It wasn't a fall, not yet, but it was a misstep that cost them momentum and blood. Yamamoto knew that the next battle would be for everything. He looked at the empty spots in his fleet roster where the Shokaku and Zuikaku should have been, and he felt the chill of the prophecy he had made. The 6 months were almost up, and the enemy was still standing. On the morning of June 4, 1942, the sun rose over the Central Pacific, casting a golden light on the greatest armada ever assembled by the Empire of Japan. It was almost exactly 6 months to the day since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sitting in the command center of the battleship Yamato, was hundreds of miles behind the carrier strike force, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The 6-month clock he had set in his prophecy had run out. This was the final day of his promised victories. His officers were confident, joking about how they would celebrate in Honolulu, but Yamamoto stared at the maps with a gnawing unease. He knew he was gambling everything on a single turn of the card. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, the game was rigged. While the Japanese fleet sailed in radio silence, convinced of their invisibility, the Americans were already waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz, armed with the decoded intercepts from Commander Rockefeller's dungeon in Hawaii, had placed his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, at a coordinate ironically nicknamed Point Luck. The Japanese believed they were springing a trap on a surprised enemy. In reality, they were sailing into the crosshairs of a waiting sniper. The hunter had become the hunted before the first plane even took off. The battle began with a deceptive success for Japan. Admiral Yamamoto, commanding the carrier strike force, launched his first wave against Midway Island. The Zeros swept the skies, and the bombers pounded the American installations. When the strike leader radioed back, "There is need for a second attack," Yamamoto felt validated. He ordered his reserve aircraft, which were armed with torpedoes for an anti-ship role, to be rearmed with bombs for a second land strike. The hangars of the Akagi and Kaga became a chaotic scene of frantic activity, with bombs and torpedoes stacked dangerously on the decks as mechanics rushed to switch the ordnance. Then, the fog of war descended. A scout plane reported spotting American ships to the northeast. Yamamoto froze. If there were enemy ships, his planes needed torpedoes, not bombs. He ordered the rearming process to be reversed. The confusion was absolute. Hangar decks were littered with high explosives, fuel hoses, and exhausted crews. It was at this precise moment of vulnerability, with planes refueling and bombs scattered like kindling, that the first American attacks began. The initial American assaults were suicidal disasters. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet flew in low and slow, without fighter cover. The Japanese Zeros, superior in speed and agility, swooped down from high altitude and slaughtered them. All 15 American planes were shot down. Only one pilot survived. On the bridge of the Akagi, the Japanese officers cheered. They believed they were invincible. The American attacks were uncoordinated and ineffective. The Zeros were doing their job, pulling down to sea level to chase the torpedo bombers, leaving the sky above the carriers completely empty. It was then, at 10:20 a.m., that the destiny of the Pacific War turned on a hinge of fate. High above the cloud layer, unnoticed by the distracted Zeros, 3 squadrons of American SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived. Led by Wade McCluskey, they looked down and saw the Japanese carriers painted against the blue sea like target practice. There was no fighter cover to stop them. They tipped their wings and began a screaming near-vertical dive. To the Japanese sailors looking up, the sun glinted off the American canopies, a flash of silver that signaled the end of the empire. The devastation took only 5 minutes. It was a holocaust of fire and steel. Bombs smashed through the flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. They detonated deep inside the hangars, igniting the stockpiles of fuel and the unsecured ordnance. The uninterruptible succession of victories that Yamamoto had promised evaporated in a series of chain reaction explosions that turned the pride of the Imperial Navy into floating crematoriums. The Akagi, Yamamoto's former flagship, was reduced to a twisted, burning wreck, her rudder jammed, circling aimlessly as her crew burned. One Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, survived the initial onslaught. In a display of desperate samurai courage, she launched a counterstrike that crippled the USS Yorktown. But the American response was swift and merciless. Late in the afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise found the Hiryu and buried her under a deluge of bombs. By sunset, all 4 of Japan's heavy carriers, the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the terrors of the Indian Ocean, were sinking or burning skeletons. The heart of the Imperial Navy had been ripped out. Hundreds of miles away, on the bridge of the Yamato, the reports filtered in like a nightmare. First, the news of the Akagi burning, then the Kaga and Soryu, finally, the loss of the Hiryu. Yamamoto sat in his chair, his face a mask of stone, though his staff wept openly. He briefly considered rushing his battleships into a night engagement, a desperate banzai charge to savage the American fleet with surface gunfire. But he looked at the reality of the situation. Without air cover, his massive battleships would be nothing more than targets for American planes the next morning. With a heavy voice, Yamamoto gave the order that marked the psychological turning point of the war. Turn back. The combined fleet reversed course, steaming back toward Japan in disgrace. The 6 months were up. The prophecy had been fulfilled with a terrifying mathematical precision. Yamamoto had run wild for exactly half a year, winning every battle, just as he said he would. But the calendar had turned, the American industrial machine had awakened, and the second and third years he had warned about were now beginning. As the Yamato sailed into the darkness, Yamamoto knew that the war was lost. The rest would simply be a long, bloody funeral procession. The return voyage of the combined fleet following the catastrophe at Midway was a funeral procession in all but name. As the battleship Yamato cut through the gray swells of the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto stood on the bridge, staring at the empty expanse of ocean where his four magnificent aircraft carriers should have been. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the floating cities that had projected imperial power from Hawaii to Sri Lanka, were gone, resting at the bottom of the sea. The horizon, once crowded with the masts of the most powerful strike force in history, was now terrifyingly barren. For Yamamoto, the silence of the radio waves was heavier than the noise of battle. The Kido Butai, the spear tip of the empire, had been snapped off. The physical loss of the ships was a staggering blow to the naval register. In a single day, Japan had lost roughly 50% of its heavy carrier strength. Yamamoto knew the industrial statistics by heart. Japanese shipyards would take years to replace these vessels. He also knew that across the ocean, American shipyards were already laying the keels for the new Essex-class carriers by the dozen. He had warned the government that he could not win a war of attrition, yet Midway had forced him into exactly that. He had gambled his capital assets on a quick knockout, and now he was bankrupt. The 6-month clock had stopped, and the era of scarcity had begun. However, the tragedy that haunted Yamamoto most was not the loss of steel, but the loss of blood. Sinking with the carriers were hundreds of Japan's elite aviators and thousands of highly skilled mechanics. These were not conscripts. They were the samurai of the sky, men with thousands of flight hours who could land on a pitching deck in the dark and drop a torpedo into a teacup. They were the veterans of Pearl Harbor, the first team. Yamamoto knew that you could build a Zero fighter in a week, but it took 5 years to train a pilot of that caliber. The brain trust of naval aviation had been decapitated. The loss extended to the hangar decks, where the mechanics and technicians had perished in the infernos. These were the men who knew how to tune the sensitive engines of the Zero and how to arm a torpedo in minutes. When the Akagi and Kaga exploded, that institutional knowledge was vaporized. The Imperial Navy was left with rookie pilots and green crews, forced to learn the art of war while being hunted by an increasingly skillful enemy. The quality gap, which had been Japan's only advantage against American quantity, was erased in an afternoon. Upon returning to Japan, the government reacted not with transparency, but with a paranoid, suffocating secrecy. They could not admit to the public that the invincible Navy had been decimated. The surviving sailors, many suffering from horrific burns, were not allowed to see their families. Instead, they were quarantined in secret hospital wards or immediately transferred to remote outposts in the South Pacific to ensure their silence. They were treated almost like criminals for the crime of surviving. Yamamoto watched this cover-up with a deep disgust. The empire was now fighting a war based on lies, unable to even mourn its own dead. Strategic paralysis gripped the naval general staff. Without the Kido Butai to act as a mobile hammer, the Japanese Navy was forced to switch from a strategy of offense to one of desperate defense. The absolute national defense zone was drawn on the map, a shrinking perimeter that they vowed to hold at all costs. Yamamoto knew this was a losing proposition. The initiative had passed to the Americans. From now on, the Japanese would have to guess where the Americans would strike, reacting to their moves rather than dictating the flow of battle. The hunter was now permanently the prey. The psychological impact on Yamamoto was visible. His hair seemed to whiten overnight, and his bouts of stomach illness worsened. He spent long hours playing shogi alone, replaying the moves of Midway in his head, tortured by the what-ifs. He knew he was responsible. He had pushed for the complex plan. He had threatened resignation to get approved. The ghosts of the thousands of sailors who died in the fires of Midway walked the decks of the Yamato with him. He wrote to his friends with a fatalistic tone, no longer speaking of victory, but only of duty. Meanwhile, the American war machine shifted into high gear. The United States Navy, emboldened by the victory, began to press forward. They realized that the Japanese dragon had lost its teeth. The fear that had paralyzed Allied commanders since Pearl Harbor evaporated. They began to plan the invasion of Guadalcanal, the first land offensive of the war. Yamamoto saw the reports and realized the Americans were not giving him a moment to breathe. They were coming for the throat while he was still trying to staunch the bleeding. The loss of the Kido Butai also marked the end of the decisive battle doctrine as a reality. Yamamoto had always hoped for one great clash to end the war. Now he realized the war would be a long, grinding retreat. He would have to feed his remaining ships and men into the meat grinder of the Solomon Islands, engaging in a war of attrition that favored the resource-rich Americans. He was no longer the grand strategist moving fleets across oceans. He was a firefighter trying to put out a blaze that was consuming the house. As the summer of 1942 wore on, Yamamoto accepted the grim truth. The war was effectively over. Japan might fight for another 3 years, but the outcome had been sealed when the Hiryu slipped beneath the waves. The point of no return had been crossed. The prophecy was complete. He had run wild for 6 months, and now, as he had predicted, the world was collapsing around him. The glory of the Imperial Navy was resting on the bottom of the Pacific, and all that was left was the slow, agonizing wait for the inevitable end. In August 1942, the war shifted from the sterile blue chessboard of the open ocean to the rotting, malarial green hell of the jungle. Admiral Yamamoto, still licking the wounds from the Midway disaster, received reports that American Marines had landed on a virtually unknown island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal. To the strategists in Tokyo, it was a minor annoyance, a dot on a map. But Yamamoto looked at the coordinates and felt a cold shiver of recognition. The Americans were no longer just defending Hawaii. They were stepping onto the first rung of the ladder that led straight to Tokyo. The counteroffensive had begun not with a roar, but with a quiet splash of boots in the surf. What followed was exactly the kind of war Yamamoto had feared most, a grinding, bloody war of attrition where victory was not measured in brilliant maneuvers, but in tons of supply and bodies. He established his headquarters at Truk Lagoon, the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and began to feed ships and men into the maw of the Solomons. He watched with frustration as the battle centered around a single, muddy airstrip known as Henderson Field. It became the focal point of the entire Pacific War, an unsinkable aircraft carrier that the Japanese Army could not capture and the Japanese Navy could not destroy. The waters north of the island soon earned a grim nickname, Iron Bottom Sound. So many ships, Japanese and American, were sunk there in savage nighttime brawls that the sea floor was literally paved with steel. Yamamoto threw his destroyers and cruisers into these battles, achieving tactical victories like the Battle of Savo Island, where the Japanese Navy humiliated the Allied fleet. But these victories were Pyrrhic. Every Japanese destroyer sunk was a national tragedy. Every American ship sunk was simply replaced by a newer model from the overflowing shipyards of the West Coast. Yamamoto was trading chess pieces with an opponent who had an infinite supply of pawns. The logistical nightmare that unfolded was a humiliation for the proud Imperial Navy. Because the Americans controlled the air during the day, Japanese supply ships could not reach the starving troops on the island. Yamamoto was forced to institute the Tokyo Express, using fast, heavily armed destroyers to make midnight runs, dropping drums of rice and ammunition into the surf before fleeing before dawn. It was a misuse of warships that broke Yamamoto's heart. His sleek destroyers, designed for torpedo attacks, were reduced to glorified grocery barges, and they were being picked off one by one. On the island itself, the Japanese soldiers were dying not just from American bullets, but from starvation and disease. They called the island G-A-2, Starvation Island. Yamamoto read the reports of skeleton-like soldiers eating roots and lizards to survive. The disconnect between the Army and Navy became a poisonous chasm. The Army accused the Navy of cowardice for not parking battleships off the coast. The Navy accused the Army of incompetence for failing to take the airfield. Yamamoto, trying to mediate, saw the dysfunction of the Japanese war machine laid bare. They were fighting two wars, one against the Americans and one against each other. The air war over the Solomons became a graveyard for the combined fleet's elite. The survivors of Midway, the precious few who remained, were sent into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal. Day after day, the Zeros flew down from Rabaul, an exhausting round trip that left them little fuel for combat. The American pilots, flying the rugged Wildcats and the new Corsairs, learned to counter the Zeros' agility with teamwork and armor. Yamamoto watched the daily casualty lists with horror. The first team of naval aviation was bleeding to death. The aces were vanishing, replaced by teenagers with barely enough training to take off and land. Yamamoto tried one final, desperate gamble in November. He sent the battleships Hai and Kirishima to smash Henderson Field in a night bombardment. In the furious naval battle of Guadalcanal, both battleships were lost. The loss of the Hai, the ship that had carried the Emperor, was a psychological blow that rocked the fleet. It was proof that the decisive battle doctrine was dead. There would be no clean victory, only a messy, muddy struggle that consumed resources Japan did not have. By early 1943, the situation was untenable. Yamamoto, the realist, had to force the Army General Staff to accept the word they hated most: withdrawal. Operation Coup, the evacuation of the surviving troops, was authorized. It was a masterpiece of deception and naval skill, saving over 10,000 men from certain death, but it was a strategic admission of total defeat. For the first time in centuries, the Japanese Empire had been forced to give back territory it had conquered. The tide had not just turned, it was receding. The psychological toll on Yamamoto was immense. He was a man watching his nightmares come to life. The second and third years of the war had arrived, and exactly as he predicted, the American industrial giant was crushing Japan. He saw the new American battleships and carriers arriving in the theater shiny and fresh, while his own ships were rusted, battered, and manned by exhausted crews. He knew that Guadalcanal was the turning point where the initiative was lost forever. As the last Japanese destroyer sped away from the island of death, leaving the jungle silence to the victorious Americans, Yamamoto sat in his cabin at Truk, looking at a map that was slowly turning red. He had hoped to force a negotiation before this point. Now, he knew there would be no negotiation. The war of attrition had begun, and he was fighting a mathematical equation that ended in only one way: the total destruction of the Imperial Japanese Navy. By the early months of 1943, the magnificent anchorage of Truk Lagoon, the so-called Gibraltar of the Pacific, had transformed from a staging ground for conquest into a hospital ward for crippled ships. Admiral Yamamoto looked out from his headquarters and saw the reality of the war reflected in the battered hulls of his fleet. The paint was peeling, the decks were scarred by fire, and the crews were hollow-eyed ghosts of the men they used to be. The Grand Combined Fleet, which had once terrorized half the globe, was now a broken sword, its edge dulled by the relentless grinding stone of American industrial power. The decisive battle had never materialized. Instead, the Navy was dying by 1,000 cuts. The most agonizing wound was invisible to the naked eye, but Yamamoto felt it keenly every time he reviewed the personnel rosters. The Imperial Navy was bleeding to death, not just in ships, but in talent. The elite aviators who had led the charge at Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean were gone, their bodies lost in the coral reefs of Midway and the jungles of the Solomons. In their place were terrified teenagers with barely 50 hours of flight time, sent into the cockpit of a Zero to face seasoned American veterans. Yamamoto knew that a navy is only as good as its men, and he was watching the collective skill of his air arm evaporate. He was trading gold for lead, and the exchange rate was bankrupting the empire. The industrial nightmare Yamamoto had predicted in 1940 was now a waking reality. Intelligence reports reaching his desk painted a terrifying picture of the American home front. The United States was launching aircraft carriers not singly, but in litters, like wolf cubs. For every destroyer Japan managed to repair, the Americans launched 3 new ones. The Essex-class carriers were arriving in the Pacific, bringing with them a tsunami of new aircraft, Hellcats and Corsairs, that were faster, tougher, and better armed than the aging Zero. Japan's technological advantage, once a source of such pride, had been eclipsed by the sheer engineering brute force of Detroit and California. To make matters worse, the lifeblood of the fleet was drying up. American submarines, initially plagued by faulty torpedoes, had fixed their technical issues and were now waging a ruthless war against Japan's merchant marine. The tankers bringing oil from the captured Dutch East Indies were being sunk at a catastrophic rate. Yamamoto watched the fuel gauges on his battleships drop lower and lower. The mighty Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built, spent most of their time anchored at Truk, derisively nicknamed Hotel Yamato by the crews because there wasn't enough fuel to sail them into battle. The Navy was becoming a static fortress, paralyzed by a lack of black gold. In a desperate attempt to regain the initiative, Yamamoto conceived Operation Igo in April 1943. It was to be a massive aerial counteroffensive designed to smash the Allied buildup in the Solomons and New Guinea. He stripped the remaining aircraft carriers of their air groups and moved them to land bases in Rabaul. It was a gamble that violated naval doctrine, risking carrier pilots in land-based attrition warfare, but Yamamoto felt he had no choice. He needed to buy time, even if he had to spend his last remaining capital to do it. The operation was a chaotic, confused melee that highlighted the degradation of the Japanese military. The inexperienced Japanese pilots returned from their sorties making wild, exaggerated claims of victory, reporting that they had sunk cruisers and destroyers by the dozen. In reality, they had achieved very little damage against the heavily defended American fleet. Yamamoto, desperate for good news, accepted these inflated reports. He declared the operation a massive success, deluding himself and the emperor. It was a tragic moment. The supreme realist was finally forcing himself to believe the lie because the truth was too unbearable to face. The psychological atmosphere at Truk became suffocating. The victory disease of 1942 had been replaced by a grim, fatalistic nihilism. Officers drank heavily, wrote poetry about death, and spoke of Gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, rather than survival. Yamamoto, whose hair had turned stark white, moved through the corridors like a man carrying the weight of the entire world. He suffered from constant stomach cramps and insomnia. He knew that the perimeter was crumbling. The Americans were not just pushing back, they were leapfrogging, bypassing Japanese strongpoints and leaving them to rot in isolation. The technological stagnation was another nail in the coffin. While American radar was becoming standard on every ship, allowing them to fight at night and see through clouds, Japanese ships were still relying on lookouts with binoculars. In the night battles of the Solomons, Japanese captains often didn't know they were being targeted until the first American shells slammed into their bridges. Yamamoto realized that the spiritual superiority the army preached was useless against an enemy that could see in the dark with invisible radio waves. The samurai spirit was being dismantled by the vacuum tube. As April 1943 progressed, Yamamoto made a fateful decision. To boost the sagging morale of the troops on the front lines, he decided to personally inspect the bases in the Upper Solomons. His staff begged him not to go. They warned him that the airspace was dangerous, that the Americans were too close. But Yamamoto was adamant. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to the men he had sent to die. He wanted to look them in the eye and thank them before the end came. It was the decision of a commander who no longer cared about his own safety, perhaps subconsciously seeking an exit from the nightmare he had predicted. The stage was set for the final act. The sword of the Imperial Navy was broken, its hilt shattered, its blade rusted. Yamamoto, the reluctant smith who had forged it, prepared to take his final flight. He packed his dress white uniform and his sword, writing a last letter to his mistress that spoke of the cherry blossoms falling. He did not know that the Americans were reading his schedule, but in his heart, he likely knew that he was not coming back. The architect of the war was walking calmly toward his own demolition, leaving behind a navy that was already a ghost of its former self. On April 13, 1943, a radio operator in the subterranean intelligence bunker at Pearl Harbor plucked a message from the air that was too good to be true. It was a coded transmission sent by the Japanese commander at Rabaul, detailing an inspection tour by Admiral Yamamoto. The message was decrypted by the magic team, and as the translation appeared on the teleprinter, the Americans stared in disbelief. It was not just a schedule, it was a death warrant. The itinerary was precise to the minute, listing exactly when Yamamoto would arrive at Bougainville, how many bombers would transport him, and how many Zero fighters would escort him. Yamamoto, known for his obsessive punctuality, had just handed his enemies the exact coordinates of his own demise. The intelligence traveled up the chain of command with electric speed, landing on the desk of Admiral Chester Nimitz. The moral dilemma was heavy. Targeting a specific enemy commander was rare in warfare, bordering on assassination. Nimitz consulted with Washington, and the answer came back from Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, likely with the blessing of President Roosevelt. Get the peacock. They reasoned that Yamamoto was unique. He was the soul of the Japanese Navy, the only man who could hold the fractured military together. His death would be a blow to Japanese morale equal to the loss of a major battle. The order was flashed to Guadalcanal: destroy Yamamoto's flight at all costs. The mission was codenamed Operation Vengeance. On the sweltering airstrip of Henderson Field in Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell of the Army Air Forces stared at a map of the Solomon Islands. The mission seemed impossible. The interception point was over 400 miles away. To avoid detection by Japanese radar, the American planes would have to fly a circuitous route, skimming just feet above the ocean waves, maintaining strict radio silence. The only aircraft capable of such a long-range surgical strike was the P-38 Lightning, a twin-boom fighter with heavy firepower. Mitchell calculated the flight path with a slide rule and a prayer. They had to arrive at Bougainville at 9:35 a.m. exactly. If they were 1 minute late, Yamamoto would be gone, 1 minute early, and he wouldn't be there yet. On the morning of April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year to the day after the Doolittle raid, Admiral Yamamoto woke up in Rabaul. He donned his dress white uniform, pinning his medals to his chest. His chief of staff, Admiral Mato Magaki, felt a deep sense of foreboding and urged him to cancel the trip, citing the dangerous airspace. Yamamoto, stubborn and fatalistic, refused. He felt a duty to visit the frontline troops to boost their sagging morale. At 6 a.m., he climbed into a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber. A second bomber carried Agaki and the rest of the staff. 6 Zero fighters buzzed around them as escorts. As the planes lifted off into the tropical sky, Yamamoto settled into a seat, perhaps gazing at the jungle below, unaware that a mathematical equation of death was already solving for his position. Meanwhile, 16 P-38 Lightnings were skimming the surface of the Pacific, their propellers kicking up sea spray. The cockpit heat was stifling, but the pilots, led by Captain Thomas Lanfear and Lieutenant Rex Barber, remained focused on their compasses. It was a flight of intense, silent concentration. For 2 hours, they flew through the blind spot of the Japanese defenses, guided only by dead reckoning. They were hunting a ghost based on a piece of paper. As the mountains of Bougainville rose out of the mist, Major Mitchell checked his watch. It was 9:34 a.m. He looked up, and his heart nearly stopped. There, descending toward the jungle canopy, were 2 bombers and 6 Zeros, exactly where the intercept said they would be. Yamamoto's punctuality had killed him. Bogies 11 o'clock high. The radio silence was broken, and the Lightnings dropped their external fuel tanks, surging upward like sharks rising from the depths. The Japanese pilots were caught completely off guard. They had assumed they were safe deep behind their own lines. The 6 Zeros frantically dove to intercept the Americans, but it was too late. The killer flight of 4 P-38s ignored the fighters and made a beeline for the bombers. The sky over the jungle erupted into a chaotic dogfight of banking wings and tracer fire. The lead Betty bomber, carrying Yamamoto, dove toward the treetops in a desperate attempt to evade. Lieutenant Rex Barber banked his P-38 hard, lining up the bomber in his sights. He unleashed a burst of .50 caliber machine gun fire and 20mm cannon shells. The rounds raked the fuselage of the bomber and smashed into the right engine. The Betty shuddered violently as flames erupted from the wing. Inside the cabin, Admiral Yamamoto reportedly remained stoic, gripping his katana, as his world dissolved into fire and gravity. The bomber lost lift, rolled to the left, and crashed into the jungle with a catastrophic explosion, sending a pillar of black smoke rising above the green canopy. The second bomber, carrying Admiral Agaki, was also hunted down. Riddled with bullets, it crash-landed in the ocean. Agaki survived, clawing his way out of the wreckage, but the mission was over. The American pilots, low on fuel and buzzing with adrenaline, turned for home. They had executed one of the most precise intercepts in the history of aerial warfare. Back at Henderson Field, the radio crackled with the code phrase, "Pop goes the weasel." The pilots celebrated, debating who fired the fatal shot, but the strategic reality was far simpler. The architect of Pearl Harbor was dead. The following day, a Japanese search party hacked their way through the dense jungle of Bougainville to reach the crash site. They found a scene that would become legend. The aircraft was a charred skeleton, but Admiral Yamamoto's body had been thrown clear of the wreckage. He was found sitting upright, still strapped into his seat under a tree, his white-gloved hand resting on the hilt of his samurai sword. He appeared remarkably peaceful, almost as if he were meditating. An autopsy later revealed he had been hit by 2.50 caliber bullets, one of which killed him instantly. The Japanese Navy, in a final act of reverence, cremated him there in the jungle, the smoke of his pyre mingling with the mist of the island he had died trying to defend. The news was withheld from the Japanese public for weeks. When it was finally announced, it was delivered with the gravity of a national funeral. The Navy Otsu incident devastated the psyche of the nation. The invincible admiral, the man who had promised to run wild, was gone. In America, there were no public celebrations, only a quiet satisfaction in the halls of power. Nimitz knew that while the war would drag on, the intellectual heart of the enemy had stopped beating. Operation Vengeance had succeeded not just in killing a man, but in extinguishing the last flicker of hope for the Japanese Empire. The prophecy was fully realized. Yamamoto had run wild, and now he had paid the ultimate price. With Admiral Yamamoto's ashes resting in a grave in Tokyo, the Imperial Navy lost not just its commander, but its connection to reality. The years of no confidence that Yamamoto had warned Prime Minister Kono about had arrived with a vengeance. The war was no longer a series of battles. It was a slow-motion, industrial execution. By 1944, the Pacific Ocean was teeming with American ships. The sleeping giant was fully awake and clad in steel armor. The U.S. Navy was commissioning a new aircraft carrier almost every month, while Japan could barely scrape together the fuel to train its pilots. The mathematical disparity Yamamoto had calculated on his notepad years earlier was now a physical wall of iron closing in on the empire. The collapse of naval aviation, which Yamamoto had pioneered, reached its tragic nadir at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. It was meant to be the decisive battle the generals had dreamed of, but it turned into a massacre known grimly as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying obsolete Zeros, were swatted out of the sky by the hundreds by American Hellcats equipped with radar and proximity fuses. Yamamoto's fear that American technology would eventually overwhelm Japanese spirit was realized in the contrails of falling planes. The Kido Butai, the force that had once struck terror from Hawaii to Ceylon, was reduced to a toothless decoy. The desperation of the empire soon birthed a tactic that would have sickened Yamamoto, the kamikaze. Realizing they could no longer match the Americans in skill or machinery, the High Command decided to weaponize the only resource they had left in abundance: flesh and blood. Thousands of young men were ordered to crash their planes into Allied ships, a perversion of the samurai code Yamamoto lived by. He had always viewed his men as precious assets to be preserved. His successors viewed them as disposable guidance systems. It was the ultimate admission of logistical bankruptcy, a strategy of suicide born from the inability to fight a conventional war. In October 1944, the Imperial Navy gasped its last breath at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. It was the chaotic, fiery end of Japan as a sea power. The massive battleship Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, was swarmed by American aircraft. She took 19 torpedoes and 17 bomb hits before rolling over and sinking, taking the era of the battleship down with her. The Japanese fleet was shattered, its survivors fleeing back to port with empty fuel tanks. The ocean that Yamamoto had briefly mastered was now an American lake, just as he had foreseen. The final symbolic death of the Navy came in April 1945 with Operation Tengo. The battleship Yamato, Yamamoto's former flagship and the pride of the nation, was sent on a one-way suicide mission to Okinawa with only enough fuel to reach the battle. It was a sacrificial offering, a Gyokusai shattering jewel. American carrier planes intercepted the behemoth long before it reached the enemy fleet. Without air cover, the greatest battleship ever built was helpless. She was torn apart by torpedoes and exploded in a mushroom cloud visible for miles. With the sinking of the Yamato, the Imperial Navy effectively ceased to exist. Meanwhile, the war came home to the Japanese islands with an apocalyptic fury. Yamamoto had warned that American bombers would eventually darken the skies over Tokyo, and now the B-29 superfortresses were doing exactly that. The cities, built of wood and paper, were incinerated by incendiary bombs. The industrial centers of Osaka, Nagoya, and Tokyo were turned into ash heaps. The beggar was now starving and homeless, while the millionaire continued to pour resources into the fight. The blockade was absolute. The oil was gone, the food was gone, and the factories were silent. In August 1945, the final, unimaginable blow landed. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the ultimate expression of the industrial and technological disparity Yamamoto had feared. While Japan was training civilians to fight with bamboo spears, the United States had harnessed the power of the sun. The spirit of the army could not fight nuclear fission. The emperor, finally intervening to stop the total annihilation of his people, broadcast his surrender, citing that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, a tragic understatement that echoed Yamamoto's early warnings. On September 2, 1945, the final scene of the tragedy played out in Tokyo Bay. The surrender ceremony took place not in a bunker, but on the deck of the massive American battleship, the USS Missouri. The bay was filled with hundreds of Allied ships, a display of naval power so overwhelming it defied description. There were no Japanese warships left to challenge them. The Japanese delegation, dressed in tailcoats and somber uniforms, signed the instrument of surrender under the guns of the enemy, marking the total capitulation of the empire. It is said that ghosts do not speak, but if Isoroku Yamamoto's spirit was watching from the deck of the Missouri, he would have felt no surprise, only a deep, melancholic validation. Every single prediction he had made to the Prime Minister in 1940 had come true. He had run wild for 6 months. He had won victories. But the war had dragged into its second, third, and fourth years, and the result was the total ruin he had guaranteed. The sleeping giant had awakened, and it had crushed the empire exactly as the Admiral had calculated it would. The story of the Pacific War was, in the end, the story of a man who saw the future and was powerless to stop it. Yamamoto was the reluctant architect of a doom he had drafted on a notepad years before the first shot was fired. The wreckage in Tokyo Bay was not just the end of a war, it was the final, tragic proof that in the clash between wishful thinking and cold logistics, the numbers always win. The prophecy was complete. The book was closed. The silence of peace returned to the Pacific, leaving only the echo of the Admiral's warning in the history books.